In modern history, much of Africa became a market for the Western powers to plunder and sell black slaves. However, there was one country that was the opposite. It was founded by African Americans returning to Africa, and that country is Liberia, often called the Little America of Africa. From its political system to its way of life, Liberia mirrored the United States. Liberia also adopted a system of separation of powers: executive, legislative, and judicial. And its legislature is similarly divided into two houses, just like the U.S. The country is divided into 15 states, also similar to the U.S. In addition, Liberia's elections, military, culture, tax system, and economic structure closely resembled America's. Even its flag was similar to the American flag, with only one star instead of the usual stars. Despite copying America's system, Liberia did not replicate the success of the U.S. Instead, it faced cultural misfit issues, which led to prolonged political instability, making it one of the world's most underdeveloped countries. In the 16th century, European countries began the 3-century-long triangular trade, transporting large numbers of African slaves to the Americas. These slaves provided the labor force for the development of plantations and mining industries in the colonies. By the 19th century, the U.S. had gained independence from Britain, and capitalism was developing rapidly through frequent trade with Western European countries. This reduced America's reliance on slavery, and many black slaves gained their freedom. However, the economy in the southern states still relied on plantations, which needed a large labor force, leading many slaves to escape to the north. This caused the black population in the north to increase rapidly, creating a dilemma for many white Americans. On one hand, since its independence, the U.S. had always championed freedom and equality, believing that blacks were human beings with the same rights as whites. The ultimate goal was to free all the slaves in the southern plantations. Had it not been for the fear of division and civil war, the institution of slavery would likely have been abolished earlier. On the other hand, Americans, deep down, believed that blacks and whites were fundamentally different races. Equality was considered only for whites, while true equality and integration between blacks and whites were seen as impossible. This belief later became a key factor in the implementation of segregation laws in the southern states. Moreover, the influx of free blacks and runaway slaves was severely affecting the lives, work, and public safety of local whites. In this context, a movement emerged to repatriate the blacks. The repatriation movement argued that the Americas were the land of the whites, and that blacks, who had been brought through the slave trade, truly belonged in Africa. Therefore, Americans had a duty to help them return home. This solution served two purposes. It aligned with the noble ideals of freedom and equality, while also addressing the issue of where blacks truly belonged. Thus, in December 1816, the American Colonization Society was formed, with the goal of sending blacks back to Africa. In March 1819, the U.S. Congress passed a bill to send free blacks to Africa to establish a colony. In 1821, the first group of African Americans was transported to a region in West Africa known as the Grain Coast. This area was not uninhabited, as many indigenous people already lived there. However, under the threat of American military force, the local chiefs were forced to sell a coastal area measuring 130 miles long and 40 miles wide as a settlement for African Americans. This land was named Monrovia, which later became the capital of Liberia. The following year, the first American African immigrant settlement was established on Providence Island near the Mesurado River. This could be considered a colony of the United States, but unlike other European colonies, it was an all-black colony. To honor the freedom of black people, the Americans named this colony Liberia, derived from liberty and liberation. After Liberia gained independence, It kept this name and even incorporated the symbols of liberty and revolution into its national emblem. The U.S. government continued to transport African Americans to Liberia, and by 1838, 8 immigrant settlements were formed, including Monrovia, New Georgia, and Buchanan. The American Colonization Society, for administrative convenience, merged these 8 settlements into the Republic of Liberia, appointing a white American governor to oversee the country. After more than 20 years of colonization, the U.S. government realized that this model was costly and offered little benefit to the American mainland. With many blacks being sent back to Africa, slaves in the southern states began to stir, threatening the interests of southern plantation owners. This led to growing opposition to the repatriation movement in the southern states. To appease the southern states and avoid civil war, the U.S. government sought to shed this hot potato and allowed Liberia to gain autonomy, responding to the local demand for independence. In 1847, the Republic of Liberia, modeled after the United States, issued its own Declaration of Independence, formally becoming an independent nation. Since Liberia's black population mostly consisted of American descendants who were deeply influenced by American political culture, the country continued to operate according to the American model. Though it lagged far behind the U.S. in power, Liberia, thanks to American support, managed to avoid being colonized during the European scramble for Africa, becoming the only independent African nation for a long period. However, despite its independence, Liberia's biggest issue became racial tensions. Some say that African Americans didn't hate racial discrimination, but hated being discriminated against themselves. Before African Americans arrived, Liberia was already inhabited by indigenous black people. Although they were all black, they belonged to different ethnic groups, spoke different languages, and had distinct cultures. After the first wave of American blacks arrived, tensions and conflicts between the two groups grew, but with American support, the American blacks maintained political control. American blacks who embraced Western culture and Christianity saw themselves as superior, proudly identifying as former slaves of American whites. They inherited the racial discrimination and slave culture from the U.S. While African Americans made up only 5% of Liberia's population, they controlled the country's political and economic power for many years. From 1847 to 1980, Liberia had over 20 presidents, all of whom were of American descent. In addition to the racial tensions between American blacks and indigenous blacks, there was also intense competition for political control within the American black population, leading to the formation of two main parties: the Republican Party, consisting of free American blacks, and the Whig Party, made up of former black slaves. By the late 19th century, the Whig Party took control and ruled Liberia for over a century in an authoritarian manner. This created a three-tiered pyramid system in Liberia, with the Whig Party at the top, the Republican Party in the middle, and the oppressed indigenous blacks at the bottom. Political struggles, especially class conflicts, led to severe internal strife. In 1915, uprisings broke out among indigenous blacks in various parts of Liberia, but they were quickly suppressed with the support of U.S. forces. Afterward, although some presidents attempted to ease domestic tensions and implement reforms, little progress was made. In 1971, President William Tubman, who had worked toward national unity, died, reigniting suppressed conflicts within Liberia. On April 12, 1980, indigenous officer Samuel Doe staged a military coup, killing President Tolbert and establishing the first indigenous government. However, under Samuel Doe's rule, the situation did not change much. He continued racial discrimination policies and ruled with an iron fist, just like the previous government. In 1989, Charles Taylor, an American-born Liberian, led the Liberian National Patriotic Front into Liberia, sparking a full-scale civil war. The front eventually split into two factions, and different ethnic groups joined the fray, plunging Liberia into chaos. The war raged from 1989 to 2003, only ending with the intervention of the United Nations, after which various armed factions were disbanded. The war claimed the lives of 250,000 Liberians, leaving the country even more impoverished. Although the Civil War officially ended nearly 20 years ago, Liberia remains one of the lowest-ranking countries in terms of GDP per capita. By 2020, Liberia's GDP was only $3.6 billion, with a per capita GDP of $734, about 1/86 of the U.S. per capita GDP. The American-style democracy promised to cure all ills has not brought peace or prosperity to Liberia. Instead, it has led to nearly 2 centuries of hatred and war. This shows that there is no universal perfect system. Blindly copying another country's model without considering local conditions will not guarantee success. Instead, it will only lead to various problems due to cultural misfit.